What about that? Oh, okay, that's... All right. Tonight we are continuing our class on Christian attitudes, and we're going to be talking about what's our attitude towards civil government. We're going to cover some passages that I suspect are more familiar and we have a lot of knowledge about, and we're going to discuss those, but we're also going to try to get to some, I would say, more challenging questions towards the end that hopefully can generate some discussion. So that's a little bit of the layout. And to start, get my slides to work.
You just can't win tonight, can you?
No. This isn't working either. This is on. Let's start with the importance of government and civil rule. So turn to Psalm 72. There we go. I'm sorry, I'm a little out of sorts tonight. Turn to Psalm 72. This isn't necessarily a psalm that speaks entirely to the importance of civil rule and government, but just read with me and listen to a few things here that the psalmist says. Psalm 72, verse 1, "Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to the royal son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. Let the mountains bear prosperity for the people and the hills in righteousness. May he defend the cause of the poor of the people, give deliverance to the children of the needy, and crush the oppressor." And then drop down to verse 12. "For he delivers the needy when he calls, the poor and him who has no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy, and saves the lives of the needy. From oppression and violence he redeems their life, and precious is their blood in his sight." Just from a very basic standpoint, what can you conclude from those verses about the king and government and the benefit of having that in place?
It's supposed to be a protection for the people.
Protection? Good. So it offers protection. What else do you see there?
It provides provision.
Provides provision, protection,
Delivers God's justice.
delivers God's justice. Any other?
Talks about providing, rescuing the oppressed, the poor, the needy.
Good, good. So these are all good things. And this psalm, to me, from a very basic standpoint, it speaks to how civil government and having government in place, it's a good thing. That's my point. Now, on the flip side, where have we seen in the Bible where having no government in place is a bad thing? Judges. So in Judges chapter 21, if you want to turn there. (17 through 21) are probably the most wicked and vile chapters in the Bible. But look at the very last verse of chapter 21. "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." And we know that's a theme throughout the book of Judges. In fact, when you study Judges, it's really showing how the nation just continues to degrade over time and how things get worse and worse when there's no king in place. But we see here very clearly, and we know what's in the chapters preceding that last verse, we see how when there's no king in place or no government in place, everyone does what's right in their own eyes and wickedness abounds. What's one other place in the Bible where we see this? Yes. Back in Genesis 6, we won't turn there, but in Genesis 6, everyone was doing evil continually, and it made God sad, and he sent the flood to destroy the world, and he saved Noah. So we see once again at the beginning of the Bible where no government in place, things just fall apart and unwind. So, having civil government, having civil rule in place is important. And I want to look at a few passages here that talk about God's role in government. So God has established civil rule within the nations of men, and we see throughout history that God uses nations to accomplish his purposes. So this is a topical class, so I am going to be going to several different passages. But if you want to turn to Daniel chapter 4, most of these are verses we probably know pretty well, some maybe not as well, but these all show the fact that God at the end of the day has put government in place, and God is in control, and God uses nations how he wills. Daniel 4, verse 17. The sentence is by this is Daniel. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will, and sets it over it, the lowliest of men. That verse, in fact, we studied Daniel a few semesters ago. That verse is a theme, it's a thread throughout the book of Daniel. And it shows us very clearly that God is in control. Now, this specifically at the time was talking about the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar, but God is in control. And as it says, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men. Turn to Isaiah chapter 10. This is a little bit different, but I think once again it establishes the fact that God is in control. Now, in this passage, he's using a different nation. Look at Isaiah 10, verse 5. Assyria, the rod of my anger, the staff in their hands is my fury. Against a godless nation I send him, and against the people of my wrath I command him, to take spoil and seize plunder, and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. But he does not so intend, and his heart does not so think. But it is in his heart to destroy and to cut off nations, not a few. For he says, are not my commanders all kings? Is not Calno like Carchemish? Is not Hamath like Arpad? Is not Samaria like Damascus? As my hand has reached to the kingdoms of the idols, whose carved images were greater than those of Jerusalem and Samaria, shall I not do to Jerusalem and her idols as I have done to Samaria and her images? So through Isaiah, we see that God was using the nation of Assyria in this particular passage to accomplish his purposes. And we see this repeatedly throughout the prophets. We see God using different nations to accomplish his purposes. One more would be Habakkuk chapter 1. At the very beginning of Habakkuk, what's Habakkuk struggling with? What's the initial thing that Habakkuk says that he sees around him that he's struggling with, that he can't get his mind around? They're sinful. And we'll just read it. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not hear, or cry to you violence and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. God, what are you doing? There's all this wickedness abounding, and where are you? What are you doing? But look at what he says in verse 5. This is what I want us to see. This is God responding to Habakkuk. Look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. So, once again, God is using nations, the Chaldeans in this passage, to accomplish his purposes. And that's something that we see over and over again throughout the Old Testament. Now, are there any other examples y'all can think of in the Old Testament where God uses a nation or he uses someone within a nation to accomplish his purposes?
Esther's a good example of that.
Okay, Esther, expound.
Okay. She was in a position as the queen
Okay,
I guess, in Babylon or in Syria at that time, and found herself in a position to influence the king and the laws that were written to the benefit of the Jewish people.
okay, good. What's another person, I'm thinking a little further back in the Old Testament, where God used somebody to accomplish his purposes? He used a wicked king to set his nation free. Come on, this is not that hard. Yeah, Moses and the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, he used Pharaoh's wickedness and his stubbornness and rebelliousness to set the Israelites free and bring them out of Egypt. And then later on, there's actually another king that we read about in Deuteronomy who God hardens his heart in the exact same way. So my point in all this is that God is ultimately in control. He's doing things that, like Ephesians 6 talks about, we don't know, we don't understand, but he's pulling the strings behind the curtain. And he builds up nations, he allows nations to fall, and he uses nations to accomplish his purposes. That being the case, if he still does that today, what about evil and wicked governments? Would you say that God is in control of those type of nations that we may see around us today? Yeah. In fact, we're gonna look at some passages here that make that point crystal clear, that God is in control of every nation and every authority. And he puts good ones in place, he puts bad ones in place, and how we respond to that, what our attitude towards those different types of rulers and nations and authorities, that's really the fundamental question we want to get to. So let's turn to 1 Peter chapter 2. We're going to look at two, I'm calling key passages. This is the first key passage that we'll look at tonight. 1 Peter chapter 2. And let's just read 13 through 17. He says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor." All right, there's a lot packed into that statement that Peter makes here, but what are some of your observations about what Peter says here in the context of this question? How should we as Christians, what should be our attitude towards government, civil rule, authorities that we find ourselves under?
Well, first of all, it makes no distinction whether they're good or bad or evil.
Okay, good.
You're subject to them.
Okay. There's no distinction. In fact, what word does he use to make no distinction? Every. He says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution." So what are some different types of, if every is what we need to be subject to, what are some different types of human institutions that we find ourselves underneath? Give some examples. Local government.
Our employer.
Employer, good. What are some different types of government rule across the world? monarchies. What else? Communism. We live in a democracy. There's socialist forms of government. And dictators, good. And then once you maybe break it down a layer from there, what types of rulers may be in positions of authority within those types of governments? Governors. Kings. What else? Prime Minister. Presidents, dictators, mayors. All kinds of different people are in different positions of authority. And in this context, who was one immediate person that Peter was referring to as someone who was in a position of authority? Huh? Yeah, the Roman Emperor Nero. So Paul makes no distinction whether good or bad. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Let me get a raise of hands. Who has lived outside of the U.S. under a different form of government here? Okay. All right. So everywhere you go, it's different. We are so used to our democracy and the rules and laws of this land and the freedoms that we're able to enjoy. But as we all know, across the world, it's very different. And this subject that we're talking about here for Christians across the world, it's important for us, but you put yourself in a different government, a different situation, a communist situation maybe perhaps, all this stuff becomes a lot more real, a lot quicker. So Peter makes no distinction. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. How does our culture, and we can talk about the U.S. right now, but how does our culture sometimes view institutions such as the government or maybe the state, maybe a city, county? How do people in our culture sometimes view government? And I know that's a broad question, but what are some ways that we could view government?
We like it when it suits us, and we don't like it when it doesn't.
Absolutely. We'll follow the government so long as it agrees with what I want to do. And then when it doesn't, lack of respect. I'm going to do what I want to do at the end of the day. I don't care what government says. And we see that attitude very pervasive in our society. I would assume that's a pervasive attitude in other governments across the world. But that's how our culture views it. Culture throws out the things they don't want to follow. And I find it interesting. They're glad, like as Dan said, they're glad to submit and do things when it fits within what they want to do. But as soon as it doesn't, they throw all that out and they do what they want to do. And we see that attitude around us everywhere we go. Why does God want us to be subject to every government, human institution? Why does he want us to be subject to everyone, not just the ones that we want to be? What's the point of that? For the Lord's sake? Okay, good. We're going to come back to that, but
You had read in one of your previous passages that the Lord is the one who put that particular person in place to rule at that time.
okay.
If we were to go against that person, we were essentially going against what God has commanded.
Yes, and hold on to that thought because we're going to come to that in Romans 13. That's our next passage we're going to look at, but you're spot on. What might be another reason that God wants us to be subject to every form of government or human institution that we find ourselves living under? Yes, Steve?
Helps us learn obedience.
Yes, it helps us learn obedience. And what does that exhibit from us towards that government or that ruling authority? Huh? Respect. Submission. If we're not submitting to the authorities that we're living under, what does that say about who we are and ultimately our submission to God? So I think that God wants us to be subject to every form of government, wherever we may be, to show our submission to authority. And as was already mentioned, who are we doing this for? Yeah, for the Lord's sake, verse 13. So, why are we doing this? We're submitting to authority. We're doing it for the Lord's sake. We're submitting to every authority. But why are we doing this? What does he say in verse 15? It's the will of God. And what else does that accomplish when we submit to authorities? Whether we're submitting to something we agree with or not, what does that do?
Silences the ignorance of foolish people.
Yeah. Our actions can speak louder than any foolish person, and our submission to government, it can teach unbelievers about submitting to the authority of God. So the way we submit to authorities and government, that can be the best example that anyone we come in contact can see. As far as if we're submitting to authority that we don't necessarily agree with, and they see that in our lives, then when we are trying to teach them and share with them about God and his plan of salvation and all those kind of things, that's going to have a much bigger impact on them because they see the way that we conduct ourselves, they see the way that we live our lives.
And it teaches our children, if they're watching us all the time, and if they see us showing a lack of respect, then they're going to do the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Look at, I'm going to bounce around here for a second. Look at Titus chapter 3. There's a verse here that Titus 3, verse 1 and 2. Remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work, to speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, and to show perfect courtesy toward all people. So that kind of reinforces the idea of how we need to live our lives, how we need to conduct ourselves. And when we do that, what does that show to the people around us who we come in contact with all the time? Shows humility. It really shows the characteristics of God. And that was going to be my next question. Who is the greatest example of submission to authority that we see in the Bible? Yeah, Jesus. Jesus is the perfect example of submitting to authority. And we're going to talk in a minute about some of the things that he did and some of the things that he said as it pertains to authority. So back in 1 Peter chapter 2, look at how Peter ends this discussion about being subject and submitting to authorities. Look at verse 17. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. So, what are your observations about that concluding statement that he makes there? Doesn't leave anyone out? Good. Good. Yeah. Everyone's included in that statement. What else?
If we fear God, we'll honor the king.
Good. Good. And we're going to talk here when we get into Romans about what comes first and second. But if we fear God, then yes, naturally we're gonna honor whatever. In this context, it's the emperor, but president, king, whatever ruling authority it may be. Other thoughts about this verse 17. Yes. And that just brings so much more power to the statement of honoring whatever authority is in place when you take perhaps one of the worst, most cruel and wicked rulers of all time, and God's saying you submit, you honor that person because of their position of authority. Yes, we are going to touch on that. So good. No, that's great. So let's turn now to Romans 13. This is another, I'm going to call it key passage that talks about this idea of submitting to authorities. Let's read verses 1 through 7. It says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." All right, so once again, what do you see in this passage? This is talking about the same principle, but I'd say a little bit different vantage point. What are some things that you see in this passage? Good. All authority comes from God. We're going to come back to that here in a second, but you're spot on, and that's, I think, probably the underlying point of this whole passage. Look at the first verse. What do we see here as far as being in subjection? What does Paul say? Okay. God's given them authority. We should respect it. Sorry I'm doing this. The very first part, it says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities." It's kind of like back in 1 Peter, we're to be subject to every human institution. Here he's saying every person is to be subject to the governing authorities. He doesn't leave anybody out. So whoever you are, wherever you find yourself, whatever government you're living under, you're to be subject to that ruling authority. And then, as was said, where does that authority come from ultimately? It comes from God. And we talked earlier, we looked at some Old Testament passages that showed a little bit of that, but we see here very plainly, I'd say more plainly than anywhere else, that God has put government in place, he's put rulers in place, and he is the ultimate authority. Now, the question then becomes, who do we obey first? Do we obey God or man? A couple passages maybe that will help us think about that. If you turn to Acts chapter 5. Verse 29. "But Peter and the apostles answered, 'We must obey God rather than men.'" So we see here where Peter and the apostles are, I believe they're in front of the Sanhedrin, and they make it very clear, we're going to obey God first and then men. That's the order. That's how we need to obey God. And then, as Marcia said earlier, we don't have to turn there, but back in Daniel chapter 3 and chapter 6, we see two really good examples of how Daniel and those with him, they were under the rule and the subjection of King Nebuchadnezzar, but when it came to doing things that were contrary to God, they stood up and they didn't do that. We see it with the fiery furnace, and then we see it with the lion's den. So Daniel's a great example of that. And then one other verse that helps us think about the fact that we obey God first rather than men. If you look at Philippians chapter 3. Philippians 3, verse 20. But our citizenship is in heaven, and from it we await a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, who will transform our lowly body to be like his glorious body, by the power that enables him even to subject all things to himself. So we see here that our citizenship is in heaven. It's not here on earth. And if that's the case, we're going to serve God first rather than man. So those are just a couple supplementary passages that help make that point from different vantage points. But if we go back to Romans now, chapter 13, let's continue on in verse 2. It says, therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. So what's Paul talking about here? What's the point he's making here?
That in general, if you follow the laws of the land, if you obey the king, if you submit to the king, then you're not going to have trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. If you obey the laws of the land, you shouldn't have a lot to worry about. If you don't do that, then how are you going to be living your life? What does he say? Yeah, you're going to be living in fear all the time. If you're breaking the law, if you're cutting corners, if you're always doing things that are contrary to the law, then you're going to be living a fearful life, always checking over your shoulder and worrying about what wrong's going to happen next. So then he goes on in verse 5, therefore one must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. I really like this verse, but what's unpack that a little bit. What is he saying there? What does that mean as far as this idea of avoiding wrath, but then for the sake of conscience? What's the point Paul's making there?
You know you're doing it for the right reason. You're honoring God in spite of whatever the circumstance is. You're doing what you know God wants done.
Yeah, you're not subjecting yourself and following the rules and laws of the land just to avoid the bad consequences. You're doing it because of your conscience, because then you know you're in a right relationship with that governing authority, which ultimately you're in a right relationship with God. So I think that's really important. I think sometimes we can fall into that trap of living in that type of way where we're trying to avoid maybe the bad things happening, judgment and wrath. But for sake of conscience, that to me is the right motivation. When you're serving God in that way, or when you're serving the government and being subject to the government in that way, then ultimately you're serving God in the right way. So then he goes on, and at the end of this section, he gives some examples of subjection. What are those examples that he gives here at the end? Pay your taxes. Okay? That's one we can all relate to. What's that? Render to all who are due. It talks in my version says respect. What else does he say here in verse 7? Fear and honor. I was thinking of where he says revenue to whom revenue is owed. What are maybe some other examples of things that we're subject to that we have to do because government has put that in place? He talks about taxes here, but maybe what are some other things? What are some...
Doug, so in New King James it says fear whom to fear. And I'm sure many people have this feeling, but if you're driving down the road and all of a sudden you hear a whoop whoop or lights go on, you get a little bit of fear in your stomach because you're like, oh my goodness, what did I do wrong? It's like, what did I do wrong? I thought it was
Yeah.
obviously I'm doing something wrong, or else I wouldn't be pulled over.
Okay, yep, good. So speeding limits and things of that nature, those are in place and we're subject to those. What else are we subject to as citizens of this government and this land that we live in? What are some other examples of things that we're subject to?
You can, for instance, if you're in a neighborhood in an HOA,
Okay,
rules that you have to follow to be in that HOA.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's an HOA. Someone earlier said employer. This is such a broad application because it applies to our everyday life and almost every situation we're in. There's basic rules and laws of the land that are in place, and we may not know all of them all the time, but there are rules and there's laws that we have to follow and we have to be subject to. As a business owner, I'm learning very quickly about taxes. There's a ton of tax laws that you have to follow, and they're very strict. And if you don't follow them, you'll get a visit from the IRS. So Paul's using just a couple examples here to really stress the point that if we're truly in subjection to government, which we're ultimately in subjection to God, then we're going to be doing the things that government has in place. We're going to be following rules. We're going to be following laws, whatever those things may be. And now let's turn to Matthew 22, because Jesus actually talks about this too, as the connection here is taxes, but he talks about this same principle. Matthew 22, beginning in verse 15. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax. As they brought him a denarius, and Jesus said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? They said, Caesar's. Then he said to them, Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. When they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. So there's a different context there. They're trying to entrap him. But what's the point that Jesus makes at the end of this? Very simple point. What's he saying?
Render to whoever it's due,
Yeah,
whether it's Caesar or the president or whoever.
absolutely. Follow the laws of the land. Render your taxes. Do other things that are required of you to follow the law. But also, you need to make sure that you're following God. That supersedes that. So that's just another example of where we see this idea of being subject to government and the things that they have in place. All right, so we have a few minutes. These are some of the questions that were in the booklet that the teachers have been following. So I'm gonna ask some of these and we'll see where it goes. So the first one is, does Paul object to capital punishment in Acts 25? So if you want to turn over there, you can look there. But the root of this question is capital punishment. And is that something that a government should be allowed to do? Is that something that is fair play? So, yes, I was going to go back to Romans, as you mentioned, Tim. But look at Acts 25, verse 11. Look at what Paul says. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. So what do we see from Paul here? as it pertains to capital punishment.
He admits that there were things that deserved death.
Yeah,
He said, if I've done those things, if I've breached those laws, then go ahead.
yeah, he doesn't object to it. Now, we know he didn't do things deserving of death, but from this passage and then going back to Romans 13, capital punishment seems to be something that God allows governments to use to enforce penalties based on things that people do, murder and other things. The guy out in Utah that assassinated Charlie Kirk, in court, the very first thing they said is, we are seeking capital punishment. We're seeking death row for this guy. I forget his name. But that's something that we see in our government. Not every state has it. I don't know which states do and which ones don't, but it's something that it appears to me God allows to be in place, and we see examples of that in the Bible. This one was a little different question. Does a Christian have a right to hold an elective office? What do y'all think about that?
There were Roman officials that were Christians
Okay.
in the elected office.
Yeah.
What better person to be in a position where they can honor God and carry out the role that they're called on behalf of the government?
Okay. Any other thoughts? What rationale might a Christian use to justify breaking the law?
That was a dumb law.
What's that?
If the law prohibits you serving God,
Okay. Yeah, if there's something that prohibits us being able to serve God, so go back to COVID. If COVID shut down or made it to where we couldn't meet together, what should be our attitude towards that? Yeah, still meet together. Because God commands us to be together, to partake of the Lord's Supper. And obviously every church they meet different times and things like that. But if there's something that God wants us to do and there's a law of the land that's contrary to that, we need to follow God.
You know, Doug, with that one, when we were talking about Daniel earlier, it made me think of Daniel 1.
Yeah.
Which is a similar situation, but maybe a little different outcome, right? Where Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they're presented with the king's choice foods, but they do not want to defile themselves. They don't necessarily like create a rebellion,
Yeah.
but they do in a way that is very wise, maybe beyond their years, because they were young men at the time, find a solution that doesn't insist in a rebellious attitude towards the king, but also keeps them in a spot where they cannot defile themselves. And I mean, you know, since it's maybe a real life example for us, COVID is one of those where you could think in very black and white terms.
Yeah.
We have to meet in this building in the exact same way we did before, or is there a way that we can still fulfill God's command and what He asks of us, while also, you know, doing it in a way to not insist some sort of rebelliousness
Sure.
to the government?
Good. No, that's really good.
In this country, we have been so blessed that we have not had been in fear of worshiping God like a lot of countries.
Yeah. Yep. No, I agree.
I don't think we really know what it's like, and I pray that we will stand our ground if we had to.
Yeah, and sometimes, it's easy to say this, but sometimes living under a government that it allows us to worship God so freely, sometimes it can make us a little, it can weaken our faith to where if we were really put to the test, maybe in another country or government or whatever, would we live the same way? Would we do the same thing? So that's a good point. All right, we're out of time. So there were some other questions that were a little more controversial, but we'll save those for another class. Thank you.